I'm going to chair this meeting on behalf of Audits, and at least for now, Paul Krikorian will be the chair on behalf of E&E Committee. And I would suggest we start, unless we have our
Would you like us to be
chair of committee.
Sir?
Plan B.
Joint meeting. Which we were just about to start.
Great. Okay. Well, I expect this to, who came from DWP today? Who came from DWP today? Let's see who came. Okay. Getting higher up on the food chain. I want to say a few things, and then I'm going to had another meeting at the same time, and I also have to go to a funeral very quickly. But what I wanted to say is, I'm glad we're doing this joint committee meeting, and it's always nice to see you. Mr. Krikorian, Mr. Kratz, and Mr. Parks have lots of questions to ask. I hope you can answer them. I don't have high hopes about the outcome of this meeting today, and Mr. Parks has made a wise suggestion that we go directly, once we're done with this, to council if the outcome of today's meeting is not satisfactory. And I will certainly be here, I'm sure, before your meeting ends today. I've asked all the questions that I wanted to ask and put them on the record already. So I don't have any additional questions to ask because, I've basically kind of formulated my opinion based on how things transpired during that period. And I think that as we dig deeper, we will find that the delay of the transfer caused the city to be fined and have ancillary fiscal impacts that maybe you, DWP, hadn't anticipated, nor did we, but we'll find in some way that through the front door or the back door, it cost us some money. So then the issue really is one of whether it was a sin of omission or the sin of commission. And I don't know that we'll find that out through this process, but it's certainly worth asking. And, Mr. Krikorian and Mr. Smith, Mr. Parks will be pretty extensive in their questioning, which should at least take 2 hours, and I think I'll be back before then. So have a go at it.
Thank you. Now, I actually think it might make sense to begin with a brief overview from the auditors to put on the record what their findings were, and then have a response from the DWP.
Good afternoon. I'm John Scomp from Crow Horwath, and John Modlin is here with me as well. I'll just briefly go over the findings in our report, and I know the report's been out there for a little bit, but I'll just go over the executive summary of the 5 statements that we looked at. Basically, our report, or our task that resulted in the report, was to come in and look at the letter that was written that said the transfer could not be made, look at the basis, the financial basis for some of the statements that were made in the letter, and see if those bases were substantiated by the actual business conditions that were existing at the time that the letter was written that would have said that really the transfer could not be made. And basically that was the gist of the letter that was written, was saying that the remainder of the transfer that was owed could not be made. And as we know, because of the fact that it was not made, the city was put on a negative watch from there and had some of the consequences that Councilman Perry mentioned here earlier. We really looked at 5 statements within the letter. First statement being that the $73.5 million transfer was really contingent upon the ECAF rate being increased. From all the financial analysis that we looked at that they had provided to us, that was really not the case. They had run a lot of different models. All those models had the full transfer being made in them. Now, there were other adjustments that were made within those models, but all the models or all the scenarios that they ran for the rating agencies and for some of their other presentations showed that the full transfer could have been made, and that really the ECAF increase was not essential to making the transfer. Second statement we looked at was the fact that if they made the transfer, then basically all of their other funds were going to have to be committed to paying the energy costs and those other things that they showed were being under-collected because of what they showed to be a deficit in the ECAF rate. I will tell you that when we met with them at the exit conference, a lot of the discussion that we went through with them, or a lot of the paperwork that they showed in support of different things, was paperwork supporting an ECAF increase. I can tell you from the exit conference with them, they truly believe they needed the ECAF increase. However, the ECAF increase and the payment of the $73.5 million were not hinged on one another. And what we were looking at there was, when we asked different questions about the financial statements they made within the letter, a lot of what we got back was things trying to substantiate the need for an increase in the ECAF rate. But that would, whether that's the case or not, it did not substantiate the fact that they could not make the $73.5 million. The undercollection that they were showing in the ECAF rate had been there for quite some time. There was nothing in the documentation that we looked at that would have said that it would have had to been caught up in 1 year, and that year would have to be this year if they didn't get an increase in the ECAF rate, and that would not have taken up the $73.5 million that was not being transferred to the city. The other thing they mentioned was the fact that they had some about $1.2 billion of bonds that had to be sold in the near future. They were basically said that they needed to have a sound financial policy, and they needed to keep with those policies in the months up before the sale. We do agree with that if you're going to sell bonds, and especially bonds of those magnitude, you do need to have sound financial policies in place so that you can go to the market and show that, first of all, those policies have been adopted and that you are committed to trying to stay within those ranges. However, we also looked at the fact that some of the things that were causing them to drop below some of those financial benchmarks were internal things that they had more options for than just not making the $73.5 million. For example, some of the things that were being done was they were spending operating funds on capital improvements. That was drawing down their cash balances, and that the cash balances were either dipping below or getting ready to dip below those internal benchmarks that were set. In lieu of just saying they were not going to make a payment to the city, could have looked at some type of interim financing, bond anticipation note, some type of commercial paper, something like that, maybe holding off on some of the capital improvements until the bonds had actually been sold. There were other things that could have been done rather than just saying we're going to try to, quote, avert a problem by not making a payment to the city. Two other things that we looked at was the fact that their letter did mention that there was a $300 million level that they believed they needed to have in their power operating fund. Their letter mentioned that was a level that was recommended to them by their consultants. Really, as we looked at that, it was not a level that was that was given to them by the consultants. It was a level that they set and then had the consultants evaluate. And the consultants did come back and say that the $300 million level they felt like would be good for the AA bond rating that they were looking to try to maintain. However, they didn't evaluate whether 250 or 200 would have done the same thing. Basically, they evaluated the level that was given to them to look at, and that was both of their consultants there that took a look at that. And the other thing that we looked at finally was the fact that they had made a statement in the fifth statement, and the final statement we looked at was a statement that they had made in the letter about the fact that any material change in the debt reduction trust fund would have some adverse consequences. And basically they were talking about material events disclosures as far as going out to the market and telling them there was a material, basically default type of notice. And it would trigger some arbitrage and other tax penalties. What we looked at there was, and as we discussed this at the exit conference with their consulting team, both the attorneys and their financial consultants, any material change is not an accurate statement. And they actually provided us with some additional guidance from their attorneys that said if the trust fund were used for purposes other than what it was intended to be used for, it could cause material event notice. But actually, if they had used the trust fund in the manner that it was set up to be used, that would not result in a material event notice. They could have used the debt reduction trust fund in such a way to actually make some principal and interest payments on some bonds that were coming due, or some principal and interest payments that were coming due. They could have used that trust fund for that and actually kept their operating fund balance up. Rather than using operating funds, they could have used the trust fund money and actually kept their operating fund at a higher level. That would not have required then a material event notice, because that's what the trust fund was there for. And the other thing we looked at as well with the arbitrage and tax penalties, that fund is subject to arbitrage and tax penalties or arbitrage and tax calculations anytime they use the fund. I think the letter gave the indication that this would be something new that was coming about as a result of what was going on with their financial situation. But as we talked to the consultants, they said no, they have to make that calculation. They have to do different, look at different scenarios every time they make a payment out of the fund. So we found that statement to be a bit of a stretch, a little unsubstantiated as well. Basically, it came down to just looking at those 5 statements. The fact that the letter indicates that they could not make the $73.5 million transfer to the city, really we just felt like the letter was unsubstantiated. They could have done it. There were options available for them to do that. I know as we talked to their consultants, the attorneys, and their financial consultants at the time as well, they had not seen the letter that DWP sent to the city, and so basically we were talking to them in more generic terms and not specifically about the letter. I know that one of the Gardner memos was attached to the end of the letter, but it was not actually addressing the contents of the letter. It was just on a single issue that was within the letter. So that's kind of a broad summary of our report. We'd be happy to answer any questions. I know it was mentioned you had questions of DWP, but we also would be willing to answer any questions you had as well.
Now, when you were here before our committee, the Audits Committee, I already asked most of the questions I had to answer, but that I wanted answers to, but I'll ask one other major one. As you heard in our committee meeting, I have a lot of concern about the process that your report shed light upon, and I've asked for an investigation of how the city can go about removing the bonding responsibilities from the DWP and look at placing it within a more neutral body like the CAO's office. If a more neutral body had been in charge last spring, do you think the outcome would have been different?
If a more neutral body had been in charge of the overall flow of funds through the utility, possibly.
On the bonding issue specifically, and the ability to claim that not taking the action the DWP wanted would affect our bond rating.
I believe that if a party, and instead of using the word neutral party, let me put it this way: if there was a party in charge that had the best interests of the city and DWP in mind, would have been in charge, actually looking after both interests, I think the outcome would have been different. If that's what you mean by a neutral party, because what it appears here is you had, the city on one side and DWP on the other, basically opposing each other on this payment. If someone had been looking after the best interest of the city as a whole, including DWP, I think the result would have been different, because you could have looked at it and said that transfer could have been made and avoided some of the things that happened at the city level, some of the consequences that they had. So a neutral party being one that was looking after the global big picture, I think the outcome would have been different, yes.
And specifically on the bonding issue.
Oh, absolutely, because I think the bonding, there's some things that could have been done there. For example, like I said, getting some interim financing, bond anticipation note that could have been paid off with the bond proceeds, some commercial paper to do, because they were actually paying for capital improvements with their operating fund that they intended to reimburse with the long-term debt. So if someone was actually organizing that bond issue and could have done some short-term financing that would have been rolled into the long-term, it would have kept their operating fund at a higher level and had a better result.
Thank you. Mr. Krikorian, do you have questions as chair of the other committee.
Thank you. I have just a few. When were you initially contacted by the Controller's Office to begin this work?
I don't have that
I don't
information in
have
front of me.
a specific date, but it was, I believe, towards the end of April.
Now, you detail much of the information in your audit report that you relied upon. Much of it seems to have been derived from DWP itself.
That is correct.
Was there any information that you considered during the course of your audit that you acquired through your own independent investigation that would not have been available to DWP's senior management prior to April 5th, 2010?
No, I think they would have had everything that we used. As a matter of fact, that's what we tried to do. That, for example, there was one of the credit rating agencies sent out a updated report that came out after the letter was written. We specifically decided to comment on the information they had at the time of the letter. So, and all the information we used would have been available to them.
Okay, very good. So, as of April 5th, 2010, had senior management at the DWP chosen to make the kind of analysis that you made, they could have done so with the same information that you relied upon.
Yeah, because like you mentioned at the start of your question, most of the information we have is information we obtained from them. There were a few things that we went from the credit rating agencies and went out and got some things online independently. I would say 90% of what we have here was provided to us by DWP.
And even that information that you obtained independently online would have been publicly available prior to April 5th of 2010.
Absolutely.
Similarly, it would have been readily available to the DWP board prior to their making a decision regarding the power revenue transfer.
Absolutely.
In responding to your draft audit report, did the DWP indicate to you that anything was factually false in your audit report?
No. Before our exit conference with them, we had an exit conference on a Wednesday before we put the report out on a Thursday. The day before, on Wednesday, we had actually met with them at the exit conference. I believe they received the report the Monday before that, so a couple days before. And at the exit conference, specifically, it was mentioned that was one of the purposes of the exit conference, for them to give us any information or tell us about anything in the report that was factually incorrect. I know it was mentioned in a couple of quotes that there were factual problems, but those have never been pointed out. And in our meeting, as I said, a lot of what was given to us at the exit conference was supporting an increase in the ECAF and not talking about any factual problems with the report.
Okay. Now, in just one second. You're familiar with, obviously, Mr. Friedman's letter of April 5th, in which he outlines the various reasons for not making the power transfer. In that letter, he indicated that the representation that the DWP had made to the Budget and Finance Committee on March 1st, that the entire power revenue transfer would be made, was based on an assumption that the ECAF increase would go into effect. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Okay.
That was one of the statements we reviewed.
Is it a legitimate assumption to make from an accounting standpoint that an ECAF increase would be made in the amount requested by the DWP when that increase had been under discussion for well over a year, was being considered by an outside consulting agency, and had not yet come before the City Council for its consideration? Would that, as an accountant, would it make sense to make an assumption like that, considering the various policy-making factors that still would need to be taken into account?
My whole career has been working with utilities on financial modeling and financial consulting, and working with them to obtain rate increases when they need them. And during that career, I found it a pretty bad assumption to assume you're going to get everything you asked for when you go into any type of legislative body or any type of regulatory body where you're asking for an increase. There's going to be some assumptions and factors that people want to look at, and so I don't think that would have been a good assumption, is to come in and say that the only way we assumed we could make this transfer was for us to get 100% of what we had requested.
Did you see in your review of the records indication that DWP staff had presented to the board various scenarios, financial scenarios, that might occur if an ECAF increase were granted in whole or in part, if some lesser ECAF increase were granted? Were there an array of financial scenarios presented to the board that the board could consider as possibilities in evaluating whether or not to make a power revenue transfer?
I can tell you we were presented with some of those scenarios, but I'm not sure what was presented to the board. As I said in our, I can't even tell you what some scenarios were brought to us. Some were during our field work for the report. Others were at the exit conference. But they had run different scenarios of different levels of ECAF increase and actually different assumptions in those. I'm not sure what was presented to the board and which were just presented to us or another body.
Now, you mentioned that much of your professional background is in advising municipal utilities. Can you talk, based on that background, a little bit about whether other utilities make power revenue transfers or some equivalent transfer to the city's general fund? Mm-hmm. And if so, what is the policy justification for making such transfer?
Different states allow different levels of transfers. Some allow transfer levels that are calculated based on a straight percentage, such as a 5 or 8% that's being accomplished here. Others require that some type of justification be tied to that. For example, so much of the city administrative salaries, so much of the legislative body salaries, and you actually tie it to certain expense levels. Other jurisdictions take a look at the value of the plant that's out there and say that the utility can make a payment to the city that might substitute for what property taxes the city may have received if it were a privately owned utility. So a lot of jurisdictions may require some specific calculations trying to tie it to either costs or some type of tax that would be there, or as what is done here, in lieu of that, you could have a substitute and say there'll be a certain percentage of revenues paid. And so, like I said, different jurisdictions view that differently and have looked at that differently. And I think the one thing is, however the jurisdiction is looking at it, the utility budgets for that payment. The city also budgets to receive that payment. And so there has to be an understanding there that both parties have a vested interest in that. And so to the extent that somebody is budgeting for that revenue and then they're told they can't get it, that is going to have some consequences on the other side.
Yeah, and more fundamentally than that, just foundationally, what sorts of payments to the city would an investor-owned utility be making, for example, if it were providing power to the people of Los Angeles rather than a municipally owned utility?
Yeah, they would be paying the income taxes, the employment taxes, and all those things that this utility does as well, not the income, but the employment taxes. But then also, property value-based taxes, those type of things would be made, and licensing and those type of things. I have not done an evaluation of what this utility would pay if it were privately owned. I say in general, that's one of the considerations that may be out there, but I've not done a specific evaluation on this one as to what the level would be.
So while the power revenue transfer here is dependent upon a finding of a declaration of surplus funds, it is, as you point out, budgeted for both by the utility and by the city, in part in lieu of payment of other forms of taxes that an investor-owned utility would pay. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Other members have questions?
I think we've covered this before, but one of the things I just want to be clear on, I think the last meeting, you said that you investigated the four corners of the letter. You did not go beyond to find out who made the judgments, who made those decisions.
That is correct. We do not.
So you just looked at the narrow statement and said whether this statement could be supported.
That is correct. We did not investigate who put the letter together, where the information came from, anything like that. We just looked at the contents of the letter and the statements that were made.
When you looked at the letter and this, and I think you made it clear that there was a real effort to justify the ECAF, even when you were asking about the transfer. And did you find in your investigation the fact that they were separated by fiscal years would also give less credence to tying those two together?
I think one of the things is they were showing that the ECAF increase was going to help with some coverage ratios and those type of things in certain fiscal year, when really the payment of the transfer didn't affect those coverage ratios. So some of the analysis they were showing as to how the ECAF would affect coverage didn't have any bearing on the transfer.
But the transfer, and one of the things that we tried to talk about in council was, transfer was based on a closed-out fiscal year.
Correct.
So contemplating a increase on a future fiscal year would have limited or no impact.
That would be correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the other issue is that we thought it, in asking in council for the documentation that was so, discussed about what they were relying on, we thought there'd be letters or analysis, and we did not get any of that. Were you successful in seeing anything that would prompt or give a basis for these judgments in the letter?
No, from their consultants or anybody, we did not. And as I said, when we were at the exit conference, the consultant specifically mentioned to us they had not seen the April 5th letter. So
They have not seen the letter that came to us using the consultants as a basis for their decision?
correct. They had not, at the time of our exit conference, they had not seen. I'm sure they have by now.
Okay.
I would assume they
Did you get any sense on, because it was the first time in many people's memory that this payment was split, that what prompted that? Because historically, it's been, like you said, budgeted for, identified, sent in one, is almost a perfunctory mechanical process. Did you get any sense of what prompted the split payment?
We did not.
Okay.
I did not get any sense because we did not look into it.
Okay.
So it wasn't an area that we dove into. So I don't want to say that it was any fault of anybody's that we didn't.
Okay. But then also on that, I think it was a comment that Mr. Friedman talked about the Budget and Finance Committee. And what was specifically asked in that meeting was, you're giving us 147, when is the remaining part coming? And the answer was within 2 months. Would that have been an appropriate place if there was a tie to ECAF that would have been stated?
Yeah, that's one of the things we did look at is when we talk about the fact that in the letter it got tied to ECAF, that was really the first time it appears that that link had been made. It had not been made to the rating agencies. It had not been made in the payments earlier, those type of things. So I think that was the first time that we looked at it didn't mention.
Did you look at a timing as to whether that linkage in that letter came after the council approved the 147? Or accepted the 147?
I don't have those notes in front of me, so I'd have to go back and I can't answer that question.
I think that's all I have.
Just have one clarification. You talked about the money that was being paid out of, I believe it was the trust fund for payments on infrastructure bills.
No, they were using the power operating fund to pay for the
Power.
capital improvement fund, the capital improvement.
Okay, was there any evidence that this had ever been done before, or was this a unique occurrence?
No, I think when in speaking to them and looking, it had been done before, and they explained to us what type of capital improvements they make out of the operating fund. I think what they were explaining to us, though, is they anticipated doing the bond issue sooner, And so they were going longer with these type of capital improvements and kept drawing from that operating fund and drawing the balance down. And that's where we came back and said, well, to the extent you could see that happening, you continuing to draw that, you could have put in place some type of interim financing to hold that balance up to where it needed to be instead of just continuing to draw down the operating fund.
So it was just a conscious decision that they were going to do it this way. It didn't appear to be an attempt to cook the books, if you would, so that it would look like they didn't have the money.
Yeah, conscious decision or just not looking at a conscious decision maybe not to look at other alternatives.
It was the easy way to do it, and they'd done it
Appears
before.
so.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you for your presentation. We appreciate it. Why don't we bring up the representative for the DWP?
Good afternoon, council members. Joseph Brivich, Assistant City Attorney and Assistant General Counsel for the department.
So are you prepared to answer questions on behalf of the department?
I am not, Councilman. You have before you a letter that was transmitted today from our General Manager stating that the department is still in the process of reviewing and preparing a response to the report, and that department takes that responsibility very seriously, and when the response is prepared, it will be provided to the council and the mayor's office.
And so there's no one that could answer questions on an interim basis about this report and their DWP's level of honesty, et cetera, et cetera.
That is correct, Councilman.
Well, that's actually somewhat amazing. I mean, at least you're here, so technically we can't say there's no one from the DWP, but clearly the general manager or someone close to that level should have been here. I mean, I shouldn't say we, I've only been here for a year, but the city of Los Angeles has gone a long time between times where the city council had to use its subpoena power. I think it was almost 20 years ago, but I think we might have to look at doing that if we can't get DWP representatives that have the ability to answer our questions to show up here. And you might pass along that possibility to the management of the DWP.
I will convey that message, council member.
So I'm not sure where that leaves us. I have a lot of questions that I suspect you can't answer.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm not sure which of these you could answer, other than I don't know if you're aware of. I mean, we certainly look at this as an abuse. Are you aware of any measures that are being taken by the DWP to prevent this kind of abuse from occurring in the future?
Councilmember, I know that Mr. Butner takes quite seriously the information that's provided to the city and the veracity of that information. So I know that Mr. Butner has undertaken a review of all the information that was provided.
Now, I know we made a request of the city attorney also at our last meeting that he look at whether the misrepresentations by the DWP met a level that could justify criminal prosecution. Do you know if the city attorney and the city attorney's office has followed up with our request and looked at that issue yet?
Council members, as you may be aware, I'm on the civil side, and for various ethical reasons, the civil side and the criminal side are segregated. So I would not be aware of that information.
And there's no one here from the city attorney's office that could answer that question,
No, sir.
despite the fact that we asked in committee a couple weeks ago to have that information back today in committee.
Again, I wouldn't be the person to provide that response to you, sir.
But you're not aware that that was even discussed and that there was any awareness or intention to come and provide that information.
I would not necessarily be privy to any such conversations. So.
Well, it doesn't leave us with much ability to get information. Mr. Krikorian, any questions on behalf of your committee?
Well, I think you started, Mr. Kratz, by saying not really sure where we go from here and where that leaves us. I think where that leaves us is profoundly stonewalled by the DWP, and I can't
Certainly
begin to express in strong enough terms how offensive I find it to be that after a report of this importance to the city, that the DWP comes to a joint committee hearing of this council without the ability to respond to it. And I would have expected that having received this kind of an audit, the DWP would have made it a top priority to prepare an immediate response. And I think it is again a real indication of institutional arrogance that we are sitting here without someone prepared to respond to this audit report in great detail. So I think that we should move this forward to council now. We should continue questioning the DWP and the auditors in council. I think that all of our colleagues will take an interest in hearing responses to the questions that we may have, and my recommendation would be that we merely move forward at this point and have a agendized item on the full council's agenda to take as long as necessary to get the answers that we need relating to this audit.
And if I could add to that, in our committee we requested a report back, which obviously no one paid any attention to. So I would ask that those report backs be made at council as part of the item. That the mayor and DWP report back as to who are being disciplined as a result of the misconduct shown in the audit. That the DWP made an unsubstantiated and false claim that there was a need for an ECAF rate increase in order to better the DWP's bond ratings and to raise the money needed to transfer surplus power monies to the general fund, and that they basically created confusion and intentionally misled the council by linking the ECAF rate to its bond rating. Number two, that we request the city attorney to report back on whether any of the misconduct shown in the audit rises to a criminal level, and if so, what can be done about it, and that we ask the CLA and CAO to report back on a timeline to remove the bonding responsibilities from the DWP and move them to the CAO. I would also ask that we subpoena the general manager of the DWP to actually show up in council and provide that information and answer any questions that we seek. So if I could make all that into a friendly additional amendment.
No, I support that. I would just ask that we also ask that someone representing the commission is also present, because a lot of the communication came from the commission, not just the general manager. And I think from the meeting we had with Mr. Buettner and council, I'm sure like anyone else is interested in saying, let's look forward. The dilemma is we need somebody that's going to put the pieces of this together that tells us what happened before he got in play. And so I think that we need someone representing the commission, and if it's the commission president or whoever was involved in this. And the other thing I think would be important for us is that in the report that I understand Mr. Buettner is putting together, we certainly need the decision points. Who made the decisions? How did they come to the decision to split the transfer? Who was part of that discussion and the timing as it relates to coming to committee? What's changed? I mean, the variety of decision points that we're not privy to, we need to make sure that we have that available, not just that it was made, but was it made at the commission level? Was it made at the general manager level? Was it made below the general manager? Who's responsible for this myriad of decisions that went forward?
Do we want to also have Mr. Friedman attend this as well, if we're looking for some of that historic information?
He's no longer a city employee, so I don't think we have the ability to, we can ask, but I don't think.
If we can investigate whether we have the ability to compel his testimony, I would have him show up to discuss some of those decision points as well.
But I think that for me, the key is the commission. Somebody or a group or a committee made these decisions, or they would have never moved forward.
Any objection to adding all of that to your initial motion?
Well, Mr. Chair, actually, I don't think I can make a recommendation on behalf of the committee since there's only two of us here, and out of deference to the chair, I would rather not make a recommendation on behalf of our committee. My preference would be that we simply move this matter forward to the council, but on the report backs and all, I think I personally don't have any objection to that as part of my motion, but I think our report should be a report of the Audits Committee rather than a joint report of the committee, simply out of deference to our chair and her inability to be here today.
That's fine. So,
and I think the one point you made in your first comment, that although you mentioned the mayor's office, there's someone, again, in the mayor's office that was part of this decision-making tree, and that's also important that we find out in whose relationship with the commission or the general manager, how did this whole plan get cooked?
and so we can ask for an appropriate representative of the mayor's office able to answer that question as part of all of this. So if we would, at least on the audit side, if we could wrap all of that into one motion, any objections?
For point of clarification, Honorable Chair, so I am to understand that the Audits Committee will move forward with a report consisting of the points that you made, requesting the mayor and instructing DWP to report to council on who is being disciplined as a result of this action, whether it rises to the level of a criminal action, also instructing CLA and CAO to report on a timeline to remove bonding responsibility from the DWP and give it to a neutral agency such as the CAO. Also, on the point of the subpoena, I'm not sure if the committee has that power, but they could certainly recommend to the council that the council take that under advisement if they wish to actually pass that subpoena.
If the committee has the ability to do that, then we would issue a subpoena to the general manager to appear at the council meeting.
However,
if it turns out that we don't have the ability as a committee, then we would recommend the council, if indeed the general manager doesn't attend that meeting, to then subpoena his testimony at a subsequent meeting.
And in addition, then Mr. Parks's reference to particulars, as pointed out in Mr. Buechner's letter, as to who were exactly involved in making the decision, and also requesting, but not requesting as opposed to instructing Mr. Freeman to attend, and also someone from mayor's office to attend. And then, am I also to understand then that Energy and Environment will submit its own report with that recommendation? Is that correct?
Well, if I may, Mr. Chair, because we don't have a quorum here, we can't in any event. So it would have to be chair's recommendation. I think on behalf of both committees, actually. I'm not sure if there's a quorum for audits or not, but we don't have a quorum here for E2. So I think this is going to have to come strictly from audits.
It could be a communication from Energy and Environment for no recommendation. That is an option. Or you could simply, since you do not have a quorum, it could be simply an audits report. But that,
just do a communication that concurs.
Yeah.
You can do a communication that concurs.
Action
of the
Audits Committee.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
would
don't.
like to
I
do
don't
that.
feel that I can, as an individual member of the committee. I don't feel that that's something that I can do.
You mean physically, or you just don't support
You
it?
prefer not to. And I'm fine with that too, if.
And of
your-
course, the entire matter could go forward under audits and communication from Energy and Environment as a no recommendation to council.
No, I think that we have significant recommendations. I would not want us to go without a recommendation. I just want to make sure that I understood when you recapped that the city attorney was asked to deal with this issue of criminal behavior. Because if I heard it.
Yes, I'm sorry, request city attorney to
attorney.
report back on whether this action rises to the level of a
Yeah.
criminal behavior. I stand corrected. So it will be an audits committee report and only, is that correct?
I believe so.
And I think to the extent that I can participate on this on behalf of E2, it would be to recommend that it go to council without recommendation of the committee. But we do, in my view, I think it's important that it move forward to council. So I would say that E2 can recommend that it proceed to council without recommendation of the committee.
All right, then it'll be a report from audits committee with those specific recommendations and a communication from EE committee with no recommendation. All right.
Or that it go to
Other than that, it go to
That it
council.
proceed to council. That the matter proceed to council without recommendation.
Okay.
Well, if there's nothing else, I think without the presence of the right people from the DWP, we are adjourned.